II?
I was in the Navy in World War II in the Naval Reserve.
Okay. And what rank were you?
I started off as an apprentice seaman in the Navy V-12 Officers Training Program, and I was commissioned an officer as an ensign in the USNR in June of 1946.
And where did you serve on your ship?
We served in the Pacific, namely we operated at Guam, Mariana Islands, and we served on 2 bird dog stations. Bird Dog 4 was stationed between Guam and Kwajalein, and the Bird Dog 3 station was north of Saipan, equally distanced between Saipan and Okinawa. And the stations were weather stations to collect data for Fleet Weather Central for the Pacific Theater of Operations. And as a ship being on station, we also provided navigational aid to military and naval aircraft going into North Westfield in Guam, which was the largest airfield in that area. And we also provided for air, sea, search, rescue situations should they occur.
How about your shipboard duties? You were a communications officer?
My responsibilities aboard ship was communications and gunnery, and because we were new officers as far as training, normally ensigns the first year of service aboard ships usually have service requirements change every 3 months. They would keep their regular main responsibilities, but they would be given other alternate responsibilities changing about every 3 months. When I first started, I was communications officer, and I continued that for a whole year. And I had reporting to me the aerologists, who were the special Navy personnel that did all the weather collecting data on board ship. And my secondary responsibility was gunnery officer for the whole ship for 3 months when I first went aboard. The next 3 months sequence, I had stores along with my communications, and the aerology was part of the communications activity because we had to send in the data through our radio lines. And the last stint that I had sonar and radar as my extra change on the 3-month program of indoctrination.
So on your ship back then, that was pretty cutting-edge technology with the radar and the sonar and
decoding.
Now, let's talk about the job of your ship. You were kind of forecasting the weather for the rest of the fleet to, protect them against typhoons and
Yes.
bad weather situations.
That's correct. We since the serious incident that happened with Typhoon Cobra during December of 1944, where Admiral Halsey was there with, I believe it was the 6th Fleet. They sustained a great deal of failure in that they lost approximately 900 men, and they lost approximately 27 ships to the sea because of the severe typhoon that occurred, and that was really not recognized as a issue of battle out in the Pacific at that time. In fact, it almost destroyed our Sixth Fleet that was under the command of Admiral Halsey. And one of the recommendations that came out of the Court of Inquiry from the hearing on that incident was a recommendation 3 that the Navy should really provide adequate information and resources as predicting severe weather in that part of the world.
So you guys were based out of Guam, and then you'd go out for 3 months and kind of forecast the weather to prevent other ships. Meanwhile, you had to go through the weather itself to protect the other ships.
Right, and there were times that the weather would be so severe. And remember, these storms, the typhoon typically in the Pacific is about 300 miles wide, and it's elliptical in shape, and the eye of the storm is anywhere from 3 to 6 miles wide, where you get very low pressures down into the 28 millibars. And the situation is that this drives very high waves, and waves can be anything from 30 to 90 feet.
And how long was the ship you were on?
Our ship was 184 feet and about 6 inches, and we were 33 feet wide. And even though we had stabilizers on board ship, such as bilge keels, and we had a gyroscope on board, we had to pay a lot of attention to how these typhoons that we would actually ride, we had to predetermine how our ballast would be. We either had to unload our tanks or load some of our tanks with seawater into stabilizing the ship. And the other thing is we try to keep the wind to our proper quarter and try to drive out of the or sail out of the storm. But we would try to request from Fleet Weather Central that we abandon station, but many times, depending on how bad the storm is and the need for information, we were not relieved, and it was one of the toughest things to go through from a Navy point of view. And a typhoon is an ugly situation because so many things can happen, and it could be just a second and you be belly up and you could be in the bottom of the sea before you know it.
So the ship is rocking and rolling?
Well, it's mostly rolling. And it hogs, the other thing, hogs and sags. In other words, you go through one and you go up on the other and you can hear it creak. The hull of the ship creak and a lot of things rattling around. And it's almost that you count the seconds that it rights itself, or that the movement of the weight of the ship isn't quick. A lot of people that did weather duty would always kid any new men coming aboard ship as to how they should prepare for the bad storms that we knew we were going to have to deal with out there collecting weather data. And many of the new men would take it lightly until they'd been through one of them, and then they recognize that you have to be prepared when you have to deal with these things, and you have to be in the right frame of mind.
You mentioned one of your skippers, his first experience wasn't...
We had a skipper that was an excellent captain, and he had been over on the Normandy invasion. In fact, he was skipper of a LST, and he made a couple of trips into the shore and managed to escape without any problems during the Normandy invasion.
Which is
and
a big feat in itself.
Yeah, and he felt that crossing the channel and weather that they went through on that landing was probably the most severe that any skipper could go through, and he took it kind of lightly when we told him that you really have to prepare for these typhoons if we know we're going to have to ride them out. And after his first trip through one of these, he admitted that it was much worse than his Normandy invasion tour. The other thing is, we had an excellent crew. Our crew was about 100 men, and the officers varied somewhere between 6 and 10. And in fact, one typhoon that we went through, I was up in the pilot house for about 26 hours without any sleep.
Wow.
And I was lashed down on the guide rail and behind me on the bulkhead because some water would get into the pilot house, and it was worse than ice when the ship would be heeling. And you just had to stay with it, and the helmsman would stay with it too, and he was lashed down. And the engine room guys would be down below, and of course they were set up so that they could answer any of the changes in the speed by the bells. But we had a very good crew, and I actually went through 3 typhoons. One was very bad, and we all pulled together. In fact, it ended up the worst typhoon. There were about 8 of us that stayed with the ship for about 24 to 36 hours. And I slept for about 2 days after that. And the skipper was very good about that, if we went through something that was pretty severe, he said, you know, you earned your right to get rest. But anyway, it was very important to collect the weather data, and because this was going to be used for many operations, particularly air, water, and land, and particularly where it could even affect Guam, could affect Saipan, but some of these storms went all the way up to Okinawa and eventually into Japan. And it was known as Typhoon Alley. And I think there have been a number of books written about the Typhoon Cobra that Admiral Halsey endured, which gives some pretty good descriptions of what men had to go through in order to survive the storm.
Now, how about, you were talking about the ballast. Sometimes they would, take on water, or sometimes they would discharge water. Would they have to discharge, good water, drinkable water, or,
Well, we actually we'd always try to take on water when we were in Guam, because the evaporators that we had couldn't really handle a load. Particularly, this is an area that is very hot and humid, and the men like to take showers, particularly freshwater showers, and we had it hooked up that we could swing either way. We could use fresh water or salt water. And sometimes we would have to dump fresh water in order to rebalance the ship based on what we knew we were going into. And the result was, the men on board really didn't like to get stuck with salt water showers.
Not too good for morale.
Yeah, and the other thing is we couldn't really unload our oil because we never knew how long or when we would need the oil, and that was something we always saved. To my knowledge, we never dumped any oil for ballast when we were out there.
So you would go out operate. How long would you operate for in the...
Well, we go steaming out the station, which could be anywhere from 500 to maybe 1,000 miles. It takes a couple of days. And we could be out there anywhere from 2 months, 3 months. And many times we would have to stay out longer because Fleet Weather Central, the Pacific Operations, didn't like to leave any weather stations unattended, particularly in Typhoon Alley. It was very important to the whole fleet and to the whole Pacific operation to know what to expect.
That was a very important job you guys were doing out there.
At first, it didn't sound very important, or it didn't sound that it was something that you could really write home about, but after you thought about it and you've been out there a couple of times, you knew how important it was. And the mere fact that the Navy took of great importance to try to predict the weather, particularly in relation to what happened at that situation off of Luzon back in December of '44.
What was that?
That was December '44 was when Typhoon Cobra went through, and we lost almost 90 men, and we lost about, I believe, 27 ships of all sizes. And in fact, President Ford, Gerald Ford, was, I believe, either an ensign or Lieutenant J.G., and he survived. He was on an aircraft carrier. I'm trying to think of. He was on. Trying to think of the name of it. But anyway.
Was it Yorktown?
No, he was on a smaller one. But anyway, he was a great hero on board his ship that he served on, and he was awarded a commendation for that. And that was before he ever even had any thought of becoming a president or even being in the House of Representatives. But in terms of the Navy and what he did to save his ship was above service, really above of what was required.
How about, so you guys are out operating in typhoons, you know, things are not...
Well, we go out to station and we drift, and of course we'd steam back every couple of days, depended. We took, navigational sights of the sun and at the stars at night, and we would, depending how far off course we were, we would try to get back to the station. I actually had a longitude and latitude, and a lot of the big planes that were flying over, bringing equipment and goods to the different islands before the Japanese surrendered, depended on us giving them fixes from down on the water, where they would call in for a latitude and longitude. When they even asked us what the winds aloft were, because they were on pretty long flights, they wanted to make sure their fuel lasted. But we used to talk to them. I used to talk to them. It was fun to talk to people that had been coming from the States or from Hawaii and that, and make you feel like you're still not out in the middle of nowhere. It gave you a little of that home feeling.
How about when you guys would record your weather, used to have to send it to...
Well, we sent it to Fleet Weather Central at Guam. They were responsible for that whole area of the Pacific.
And you mentioned that you used to send it through balloons?
Well, what we did was we had helium, and we had these big balloons that we would fill up, and we had electronic equipment. At that time, it wasn't the state-of-the-art that it is today, but we would release the balloon, and it had transmitters on those balloons. They were like little radios, but these were transmitters, and they would transmit the wind speed. They would actually calculate things, the barometric pressure, the temperature, and we would take the wind direction by our aircraft. We would record things with our radar, aircraft radar. We compile all this data and we would send it in to Fleet Weather Central at Guam, and they would put together all their grids and that and send up the predictions.
So when you sent the balloon up, was it attached to your ship?
No, these were free-floating balloons. They would take off, and we could see them for quite a while.
And they would transmit information back to the ship or back
Ship.
to Guam?
No, back to the ship, and
okay.
we would put it in tabulated form. We collect all that data. It would actually print out on recorders, and we would collect all that data. We had a crew of virologists, which in the Navy, that's the same as being a meteorologist, but they were weather people. And I had responsibility for them to make sure we got the data and we sent it in. If they had any problems with the equipment, I had to make sure it got taken care of pretty quickly. Or we would call them to Fleet Weather Central and tell them what the problem was. And of course, we communicated back and forth with Fleet Weather Central verbally or through code. And then they would send out the weather information, and we actually got that by code. And that's when we could see things occurring that we'd say, well, these are all the right conditions for a pretty bad typhoon.
Perfect storm.
And we'd go to the skipper and recommend, give the skipper the information and recommend that we should really abandon course, or at least get out to the fringes where the winds won't be as strong, the waves not as high, and at least we can maneuver the ship more safely. And the skipper would request abandoning station, but one of the times we were asked to stay there.
Do you want to get the phone?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
They can leave a message.
Okay. So, is there, I was in the Navy, and, shipboard life, is there anything you want to say? I can't even imagine being out there with a 150, 130-foot, ship in the middle of a typhoon. You guys, how about and you were out there for 3 months at a time.
Sometimes up to 3 months, yeah. But the other thing is we used to we get cans of movies, and sometimes the guys would see them 3 or 4 times over, if they were good enough. And we had the guys play cards. Of course, we told them they shouldn't gamble or anything like that, but they would play cards. The guys go down and drink coffee when they're not on their watch. And there are a lot of things that men have to do out there to keep the ship in good condition. And the other thing is when the weather's not too good, it makes other things more difficult aboard ship. But when weather's good, there's a lot of paperwork that goes on. For a whole ship to operate with about 105 men aboard, you got to be concerned about ship watches, that everybody sequenced at the right order. You got to think about their eating. You think all about their needs. And then the other thing is we did do some work with the Red Cross where if there were anything serious with families, we would send messages over the ships, transmitting or receiving back and forth, besides mail. And there was always activity. One of the sidebars that I had was I was the morale officer aboard ship. But the most important thing that I found with the men was to get good fresh ice cream at least once every trip. But there was a lot to do. A lot of the men read books. A lot of the men used to go back to fantail. We had a couple of guys that played guitars. and used to sing and that. They had their own entertainment when they weren't on watch. It was a really unique crew that we had. Most of the men were from the southwestern part of the country. From you, I was myself and another officer and the skipper with only 3 on board ship that were from the east. But it was a clean ship. Everything was in pretty good repair. All the men got along with each other, and in some respects, it made the boredom be fulfilled with the interest that you didn't get bored. And the other thing is, other than the weather, that's what we're out there for. But sometimes it would be nice that we go out there and wouldn't have any bad weather. But you know, the Pacific was supposed to mean calm.
Doesn't sound like it.
And it doesn't. It's pretty bad in certain parts of the Pacific. But
did you keep anything for good luck or any home items that?
No. One thing out there that was still in requirement. We weren't allowed to take pictures, and we only had one camera, and that was the ship's camera. And yet we had to clear it, even myself, even the officers, we had to clear it with the skipper if we were going to take pictures of anything. The war was still on up to that point in time, and you could take pictures on land if it's of a person or
when you're on Liberty.
Yeah, on Liberty and that. But when it came to board ship and anything related to it, we were limited. That was one of the requirements of maintaining intelligence.
And when you guys were operating towards the end of the war, there was a lot of talk about invading Japan, and you guys were starting to train for that. You mentioned.
Well, originally, my understanding, and I have records to that fact, where people up in the political circles with Washington mentioned that the primary purpose of the V-12 program was to train officers for the Japanese invasion. And fortunately, and I think from history today, and I know there are Japanese people, because I've worked over in Japan since the war, that will admit that it was a proper thing to bring the war to quick termination when President Truman made the decision to drop the H-bombs. And I think we saved a lot of people in our own country, and I couldn't really think of what it would have been or how it would have ended up if we had to go in there. Because some of the reports that we got back early was the Japanese culture was they were going to fight down to the last standing person at any cost. So, and what had happened was we were really being trained for that, and what came about was for those that stayed in the Navy after being commissioned, the Navy had very good use of us, and that they had developed a weather system for the Pacific in order to keep everything good operations, and we were part of that. We were, part of the support, really.
Right.
So that is really the justification of my being trained and being put in an activity during World War II. I take my hats off to the Navy or our government for being forward thinking, and that was something they overlooked in the beginning, but they learned a lesson and they provided a response to it.
So what you did on that ship, protected a lot of other ships, and and changed, or a lot of operations,
Correct.
naval operations, yeah.
Correct. So today we're lucky we have GPS and satellites, but we didn't have them.
Did you keep a personal diary at all, or while you're?
No, I wrote letters at home, and they were more personalized than what they were about operations and that.
Yeah, you probably couldn't write.
I used to write poems.
Oh, really?
That was one of my hobbies aboard ship. And I did write a couple of sea poems that I still have copies of.
Would you like to share any of them?
Well, I'll share one of them, called Crossroads of the Sea. But I used to write poems back to my folks and friends, and we corresponded that way. And I used to have responsibility for the mail for aboard ship, and I made sure we
That's
got the mail.
That's why you were a morale officer also.
Yeah, we got the mail, and we got it out to the men as soon as the boatswain's mate got back with it. And he was the guy that picked up the mail every day. I checked to make sure he did it, first thing in the morning. And a lot of guys look forward to that as a morale booster. And a lot of guys did write. I used to have contests on how many letters a guy, to make sure they do write, because some people just don't like to write. But we used to do interesting things to keep guys on their toes that way, and they had fun about it.
How about when you guys pulled into port, you went back to Guam?
Yeah.
Or Liberty?
Our home port when I was aboard ship was Apra Harbor in Guam, and that was very interesting because over the year that I was out there and we were going in and out of the harbor to the station, they put a whole new breakwater in, and it was amazing what they did, and it really stilled the water in the harbor because they used to get some pretty good storms before the breakwater that some of the ships would have to go to sea because it was too dangerous if they broke their moorings or let go at the docks to be in there. So that was interesting. I rode one typhoon inside the harbor that wasn't too bad. It was, the highest winds were about 125 miles an hour, but it was a calm sea.
Wow.
Calm harbor, but the winds were terrific.
How about, you mentioned when you were on Guam, you were able to attend some of the Japanese trials?
Yeah, I attended the Japanese war crime trial in Agana at Camp Mariana, when they were trying Lieutenant General Tachi Anna, and along with some other officers, and they were found guilty and they were put to death. I didn't follow up on where they were put to death or how, but it was very interesting. And I had heard about it when I was in the NROTC program back at Brown University, because we used to get flicks for training that would give some of the history of what's going on with prisoners of war and so forth, and how the Japanese were treating them. And I recalled that one where they had cannibalized some of our pilots that were picked up Pacific. And but I understand, I try to follow up on some of that. I understand there were over 1,000 Japanese men that were brought to trial in the Japanese war crime trials, both in the Philippines, Guam, and I believe in Tokyo. after the surrender was signed.
And you mentioned that there were still Japanese hiding
Yeah.
out in Guam when you were there.
When I was there was still Japanese hiding out in the jungles and up in the caves. Guam has mountains and has jungles, and we were told to carry sidearms, which we had to do, particularly
45.
officers. Yeah, 45s. And that was the other thing. We got a lot of practice with pistols. When we were out to sea, we did the fantail. Of course, we had to check out with the skipper. Skipper had to approve it, and we'd be out there shooting off of the ship, not anywhere where it could get back. But it was good practice, particularly when the ship was moving up and down. The other thing, you mentioned before morale. The other thing that we had, which we used to catch big white-bellied sharks about 12 to 15 feet long.
Really?
We used to have a steam fitter used to make these big hooks, and with a lead on them, wire leads, and we used to put some of the bad meat that went bad, and we'd hook them on and trail it on the stern of the ship, or if we're just floating out there, not underway. And we got some big sharks that we dragged up, and we used the boom to drag them up. And the big prize were the shark's teeth. The guys always were fighting to get a couple of shark's teeth from it. And
so that was like gray white sharks?
Yeah, they were great white sharks. They were big monsters, boy. That's one place I didn't want to swim. We used to let the guys men swim off the fantail, but we had to have a watch, and no garbage or anything should be put overboard.
You had to watch with somebody with a rifle?
With the submachine gun, a Thompson.
Oh, really?
Thompson 45.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to have these stations for depth, on the stern, for even though we had depth finder on board ship, but we used to do with the lead line, just be safe. And one of the men would sit up there or stand up there, leaning against it. It's a little platform that goes out the side of the thing with his submachine gun. Not pointing towards the men.
Right.
But it's all part of people trying to find amusement when they're out at sea like that. It's almost like being in a lighthouse, but at least at sea you got a little more mobility than being on a lighthouse, which is on a rock somewhere, and or away from land.
And you have some photographs we can take some pictures of after.
Yeah, I have some pictures of the ship that you could take there, and I have a picture of me when I was commissioned an officer in the Navy.
And you're third generation Navy.
Correct. You can take this. That's basically what our ship looked like. That's the 877. Now the only thing is, this wasn't a weather ship. It wasn't modified.
Do you recall any particularly humorous event or unusual happening? I'm sure there must have been many of those.
No. The humorous thing, it may not be a humorous event, but we always tried to make sure our ship was outboard all the other ships.
Oh, right.
Because of people trampling across, and we took a lot of pride in the condition of our ship, and the problem is, if you were inboard, men were always crossing your ship to get to their ship, and either that or interrupting guys that are working and so forth. And the other thing is, if you were inboard, it had always meant another ship was going to pull up alongside you, and he could put dents into your hull. And that's the other thing that we were always concerned about.
Right, right. Do you remember your last day of service, or when you going back to the States?
My last, but what happened to me was the skipper was trying to talk me to stay in the Navy, and he was working on me, and I happened to go up to the airport to see another officer that got off before me, and he was going back to San Diego Repair Base because he had some temporary duty time before he got enough points to get out. And I remember that the skipper, when we were, time to go, he was going to take me up in the command car. We used to have our own command car that we used to actually, we had a boom, and we used to take it away with us, because if you leave your command car behind, somebody else is going to steal it from or pull
So
rank.
you should take it with you underway.
Yeah, we used to shock it on board, and but anyway, he said, I'll take you up to the airport, because I could have had one of the men take me up, and he said, I'll take you up to the airport. And we got up there and we talked and that, and he said, I really hate to see you go, because he said, of all the, and I'm toot my own horn, but he said, all of the men that were aboard ship, meaning the officers, he said, I really like you and got along with you the best. You seem to be the most cheerful of them all. And I kid him. I said, I guess that's why the first skipper made me morale officer. And he chuckled. But he really hated it. It was hard to say goodbye to him, because he was such a good skipper, good captain. And he was very smart, very bright guy. He read a lot of books when he was on board ship. And I think I told you the story when I was in the wardroom. We were all meeting the first day or two that he was aboard, and he was, going around and asking us where'd we go to school and so forth and that. And then he had asked me, and I told him I went to Trinity College in Hartford, and he hesitated. He said, where'd you go to school? And I said, Trinity College in Hartford. And he said, that's a good school, isn't it? And I said, I liked it. And he says, well, let me tell you, I graduated from there in 1937. So I think that was the other part of his liking me was,
So you were in
we had a connection,
You were pretty good with the skipper after that.
Yeah, well, we had a connection anyway. He used to, at times, when we'd be up at the officers' club, he'd talk about when he was there. And I was, I was interested in listening to him. He had belonged to a fraternity there. I had belonged to one at Brown. It wasn't the same as the one he belonged to at Trinity, but he told me some pretty good stories. So he was a good storyteller. So that was nice. That helped. And then I flew. I got on the plane and I flew, and we took off. And we were going to we were only going to stop at Kwajalein or Wake, but we're going to make it all the way right to Hickam Airfield in Hawaii. And anyway, I got on the plane, we took off. We were out about an hour, and of course we went over Bird Dog 4, and I was in 7th Heaven. And of course I told the pilot when I got on board, I said, "Are we going to? You going by Kwajalein?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Yes." He said, but I said to him, "By the way, I was one of those guys out in the Bird Dog Station on the weather ship. He said, yeah, really? He said, I'll let you know when I go over it. And we went over, and he you know, had me come up to the cockpit, and there it was down there, another piece of E. And that was nice. Then a little while after that, I got back, and we had bucket seats. It wasn't like a commercial airline. And I look out at the wing, and we had 4 props. I forget what air type the plane was. And one of the engines are red, glowing red around it on the wing. And I got up and went up to him and told him, and he said, don't worry about that, that's no problem. He said, I'll turn the CO2 on. He said, that'll go away, but he said, you know, it can go a little while. He said, you know, I like to keep the CO2. So anyway, before I knew it, after I got back in my seat then, it went back to the, you know, regular middle color. But then I was watching that wing all the way back to Hickam. Then we got into Hickam, and they had no flights. All the flights were booked to San Francisco, to Suisun Fairfield was the Air Force base.
Hickam is Hawaii?
Yeah,
okay.
Hawaii. And so I was there about 2 weeks before I got passage out. And that was nice because I was able to go down the beach and sit around. And it wasn't much. It was still, you know, at the end of the war. But it was nice to get back. And I went over to, I was at Pearl City, the BOQ there, Quonset huts, you know. And we got our meals there on that. They provided the meals. But I took a tour over to the War Memorial. It wasn't a war memorial, but to me it was, going over looking at Arizona and that. And that was horrendous. And then I got notice that I was booked on a flight, and I went up, and we came in San Francisco, north of it, and Suisun Fairfield Airport. It was Air Force air base. Fog. And it was the first time I was on a plane with GCA, ground control approach, and he made a beautiful landing. You couldn't see anything in front of you. And I was back at, went down to, took a Navy wagon bus down to San Francisco, and I was at the BOQ there overnight.
What was that like landing on the U.S. soil after
Oh,
all that?
Terrific. And yeah, the other thing, I was dark as anything from being out in the Pacific for a year. You know, blue eyes and really dark skin, and my hair was blonde as anything. That's when I had hair. And everybody's looking at me. It was funny. Like I was a native and came back from the States. And then the next morning, they got booking on a train down to Southern Pacific, down to all the way to San Diego. And of course I had a report there, and I was there for 2 weeks, and I was separated from there. And then it was long. When I went out, I was bumped 3 times. I had to take the train all the way out to San Francisco from New York. That was a trip, 3 days on the railroad, in whites. That was awful. I had to buy another uniform.
I was going to say, the whites were too white after that.
But anyway, I got home. My dad was waiting for me in Grand Central. I took the train to Salt Lake City because one of the officers aboard ship, he mustered out about a month before me. And I had called ahead. He wanted me. He said, when you go back to the States, you go back east. He said, even if you fly, stop at Salt Lake and, you know, give me a call beforehand, stay for 2 weeks. I'll take you around and show you the whole place. And I did that, and I had a wonderful time. And I actually got to Salt Lake and got on the water, went up the Wasatch Mountain Range. We had a good 2 weeks, and he took me in the Mormon temple, not in the inner part, but in Salt Lake, and that was very interesting. And then I got on a plane to go to Chicago because I couldn't get a plane all the way through New York. So I get on the plane, and who's on the plane? And I was wondering, what's all the newspaper guys around and all that? And it was Henry A. Wallace. He was vice president under Roosevelt, but he was running as a third party for president when I forget who it was. It was let's see. It was when Truman was run. That's who it was. So, Truman's first term, because his first term was where he was vice president. He became president when Roosevelt died, and it was the second, his first real term, but the second term that he would be in office. And Wallace was on, and he got off in Chicago. And then I had to get off anyway, and I got a train. I got the 20th Century Limited in New York, and I called ahead. My dad was there waiting, and then my mother was home, and he met me at Grand Central, and we had, it was a night train, and we had breakfast, and then I went home, and that was it. It was hard to be at home because I couldn't believe I was home. You always were doing something, or you're planning to go somewhere. There's nothing where you're sitting still. Something's always happening. And I got home, and it was almost a letdown. But anyway, I had to sign up for school and take care of my VA stuff. And
so you used the GI Bill to go back to school?
Yeah. And everything pretty much fell in place. I saved enough money to go back in school and live on more than $50 a month from the VA. So that was the other good thing about being on board ship a year, was you had no place to spend any money. I sent it all home, and it added up. That's when a buck was a buck.
Now, did you join any veterans organizations?
Yeah, I belong to the American Legion locally. I didn't join the Navy League or any of those organizations. See, I had a job that I started off, I was always busy, and then when I worked in New York City, I lived in Peekskill, and I spent almost 2 hours door to door twice a day, and I read a lot in the train. That was one good thing. I read 2 or 3 papers a day, newspapers, and but when I got home, it was be a long day, so I really didn't have time for organizations. Go to church on Sunday, and that was it. But vacations were good then, and then when I joined General Foods, I was always working all over the country. I started out in engineering with them for 10 years, and I ended up working in Houston and Dover and Dorchester, Massachusetts, and Chicago and Woodburn, Oregon, and Hollywood, California, and I couldn't join anything because I never was around. Unfortunately, I had a wife that was very good, and the boys never weren't got into trouble, or and the youngest guy once said, "Who's that man?" to my wife. I hope he was kidding, but anyway,
How do you think your military experience, through World War II affected, or how you lived your life from there?
Well, I think it did a lot for me, even being very regimented in college, because we were on hours. You couldn't leave campus. It was a ship. It was like Annapolis or West Point. You had rules. The other thing is, early in the morning, you're up at 6 o'clock. The alarm, they had bells like the Navy.
Yeah.
You know, went off in the dorm, you had to get down and muster within 10 minutes. Then you either did calisthenics if the weather was bad, or you went and ran in formation for at least a mile, back and forth, 2 miles. Then 6:30, usually back at 6:30, you get cleaned up for mess, to go to mess, and then 8 o'clock you start in classes, and you go on to 6 o'clock. I mean, we used to take 6 courses. 6 courses.
That's a full
a semester.
Yeah.
And then we had classes on Saturday morning up to noon. Then we drilled before we had Liberty or anything. And at 10 o'clock at night, lights out. You get caught with your lights on. You got a couple of demerits, 10 demerits. You have to boot camp. Did almost 2.5 years of that. And then we did get a vacation at Christmas and at Easter. Got none in the summertime with school. So the thing was that you got along with other people, and you can always, as a team, you were a team player. That's the biggest thing. You're a team player. And team objectives, things like that. So when you got into the business world, it was easy. And as far as going aboard ship, it's regimented. And you're a team. You got the right side and the ports, the right and left side of the ship, but that's just liberty of doing certain things or watches or, but that's, the objective is so spread the load evenly. Somebody's order's got to be there with others gone. But the fortunate thing was we were more of a support group, just like if guys stayed in the States most of their wartime, they were support. But somebody had to do it. Somebody had to.
Very important role.
That's, to me, is part of the team. And that's what I learned in business. I was very successful in business. I moved right up the ladder. And what the public provided me for an education, I did very well in engineering. That was my entry level, and that was my base. So whatever I did, I always have a fallback. I wasn't afraid. I was putting the things I said, I don't have any experience in that field. My boss says, look, you got the capabilities, don't worry, that'll come naturally. And I was lucky.
Well, we certainly covered a lot in this
Yeah.
interview. It's some very good, interesting stories.
Yeah. And I was very active in my working career, and I put a lot of that back on the Navy. I think one area that did me in well was Boy Scouts. My folks, my mother traveled, she was a school teacher. My dad he used to go on trips. Of course, he was in the Navy, and then he worked for the Navy. He used to go on sea trials and that, even though he was a civilian, he had to go on the sea trials. So my brother and I go away for camp all summer, with other kids. We'd learn to get along. And that helped out. And then, of course, scouting, I learned a lot from people, willing to take time to teach me things, and, we're good. And I think the reason why I was an Eagle Scout put me in good stead as far as getting into officers training program. I think that was a big thing. Besides my marks, everything else being equal, that was a big plus. I almost went to Annapolis.
Wow. Okay. All right. Is there anything else you'd like to add for the interview? I know we covered a lot.
Yeah.
You certainly have some good experiences.
Well, I think the other thing is the travel really helped me out, because when I had to travel in business, I was very confident. You know, I wasn't afraid to do things like other men were.
Mm.
Or wives were afraid of their husbands going away and all that stuff. And when I think of it, I was bumped 3 times on a flight by officers of higher rank, but I went across the country in a train. You know, and it takes a little courage to do it, because I wasn't on a sleeper either. And of course, later life, I used to take train trips where overnight I'd go sleeper to Battle Creek. You know, get it in the morning. The train gets detached. The guy's there to pick me up, go to the office.
Mm.
But I think of that, and I think that I went halfway around the world. You know, when I was 21, anyway. But at that point in time, I pretty well had a lot of confidence of doing things and working with other people, and you know, not being afraid of anything. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's... At a young age, you went through a lot.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I went through the Depression, so did a lot of other guys. And you know, people say there was tough times. There were good times too. People were close together, a can-do spirit, you know, not afraid to lose things, you know. It's different.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a lot to learn from your generation.
Well, I think they can learn, but the question is, can they accept it? But it's true. I mean, I think a lot of the guys I grew up with, they've all done well. I went to high school with Dick Ogilvy. He was in a couple of he was governor of Illinois. Not like the governor now, or the ones that they had that are in jail now out there.
Right.
But Dick was a veteran of World War II. He got shot up over in Europe, part of his face.
Mm.
He was a judge. How he became governor, he was an honest judge in Cook County. I was a classmate of Tom Metzger, Trinity, after the war.
Mm.
He was in a couple of I knew Tom, passed away last year. Good guy, honest, good guy. He was from he was from the Depression era. But a lot of guys, you know, there were good people in politics those days.
Yeah. Yes.
Came up the hard way.
All right. Well, thank you very much,
You're
Mr.
welcome.
Cerosky, for your time. And we will kick this into the archives.